Welcome back to the 4Heroes podcast. Today's episode is a continuation of our study through Exodus at the 4Heroes Huddle. In Exodus 19, we find the Israelites camped at the base of Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. This is the very place where Moses once encountered God in a burning bush, and in this passage, he returns to the scene of that divine meeting. God carried his people out of Egypt, and now he's calling them to live differently, to be a holy nation. Like the Israelites, God offers us deliverance. But we are called to more than just salvation. We are called to live differently by following Jesus.
It's good to see your smiling faces on a Monday morning. On this particular Monday, we have reached a real turning point in the story of Exodus. I'm going to read to you from Exodus 19. I'm only going to read the first 6 verses. I encourage you to read the rest of the chapter and think about the majesty, the power of God. The Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai are just in shock and awe. They say that the way to the promised land is always through the desert. I think that's absolutely true. If you think about your life and you just think about that metaphorically, the way to the promised land, if you're a believer, it's through the desert. It's a hard path. But on the other side of it is the Jordan, and we're going to cross that Jordan River one day and step into the land of promise, into the land of living, and it's going to be beautiful. What helps you get through the desert is the occasional mountaintop. It's where the Israelites are. So I'm going to read to you, starting in verse 1. On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt. So this is all pretty quick. All this stuff that's happened since they left Egypt, this is 3 months and a day. On that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai, and after they set out from the desert of Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. The mountain is Mount Sinai. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you're to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you're to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites on my behalf." Now, I don't know where you stand on the beach versus the mountains, but I am firmly a mountain guy. I can do without the heat. My favorite time to go to the beach, if I'm going to the beach, is the colder months. There's less people and there's less heat, and I'm not a big fan of heat myself. I like to get up into the mountains in the cooler climate and to be able to just see what feels like I can just see forever. Even the smell of the trees in the forest, everything about it I find appealing. Now, when I say mountains, I don't mean the North Georgia mountains. The North Georgia mountains are pretty, but I took a friend of mine named Eric up to western North Carolina one day. It's just a day trip. We stopped off in Dillard and had a little bit of nourishment and riding through North Georgia. And he's just oohing and awing, he's pointing, that's kind of his go-to. And I said, well, this is not where we're going to stop today. We're going to keep on going. I'm going to show you some real mountains. We drove up into Cherokee, North Carolina, kept on going down 441, past a big field full of elk, and up the mountain to Newfound Gap and Klingman's Dome. And we got up there at Newfound Gap, and I pulled into the parking lot. You can stand there, with 1 foot in North Carolina and 1 foot in Tennessee. Everybody's got to do that at least once. I'm showing him, you can see from that vantage point, you can see the highway that you've come up from Cherokee sort of looping through the mountains. You can see cars coming up it. It's one of those places where you just feel like you can see forever and ever and ever. It's gorgeous. And I remember Eric searching for words. He said, "I can see why you like it here. It's just so, I'm waiting to hear what's going to come after so mountainous. Well, he's not wrong. It is. And when I go there, when I go up into the mountains, it does something for me emotionally. Maybe it has as much to do with what I'm leaving behind as what I'm going to, but it does something for me emotionally. I mean, it like lifts my spirits. I literally feel closer to Jesus when I'm in the mountains. Maybe it's just the elevation getting to my brain, I don't know. I feel like revived, not just physically, emotionally, mentally, but even spiritually. It's good for me to go to the mountains. The Bible's full of moments like this on mountaintops. God makes a covenant with Noah on top of Mount Ararat. God provides a ram for Abraham as a substitute for Isaac. Jesus himself is transfigured on the mountain that we call Mount of Transfiguration. All kinds of things happen on these mountains. Now the Israelites have arrived at the base of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is sometimes in the Bible called Mount Horeb. It's sometimes called Mount Seir, S-E-I-R. It's sometimes called Mount Paran. If you're familiar with Mount Paran Church of God in Atlanta, that's where Mount Paran comes from. And then sometimes just called the Mountain of God. Moses, for what it's worth, is kind of returning to the scene of the crime. 40 years prior, when he was a shepherd working for his father-in-law Jethro, he was on Mount Horeb, also Mount Sinai, tending sheep when something caught his eye. A bush that was burning but not consumed. And God spoke out of that bush and called him to deliver his people out of Pharaoh's hand. This is the first time he's been back to this place. And he comes back and he's going to have another encounter with God there. Mount Sinai, it's in the Sinai Desert, technically I think in Egypt. It's granite rock, 7,500 feet. So to compare that, one of my favorite places to go in the western North Carolina mountains is Mount Mitchell. Mount Mitchell is the highest peak east of the Mississippi in the U.S. Mount Sinai is almost another 1,000 feet higher. In the next chapters of Exodus, he's going to go up and down Mount Sinai at least 7 or 8 times. Moses is in pretty good shape, I would say. This is where the Israelites are for the rest of this book. They're encamped at the base of Mount Sinai. You could say that the first 18 chapters of Exodus are all about the people getting out of Egypt, and that the remainder of the book is all about getting Egypt out of the people. Believe it or not, it feels like it's easier to get out of Egypt than it is to get Egypt out of us, God's going to give the law, instructions for building the tabernacle. And the truth is, starting here and going through the first 10 chapters of Numbers is the Mosaic law. I mean, they're not going anywhere. So the last part of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first part of Numbers all happen at the base of Sinai. It's over 600 commands, not just the 10 that we're all familiar with. They contain moral law, ceremonial law, and civil law. 63 chapters of the Old Testament are devoted to events that happened at Mount Sinai. Well, that's a lot of detail and information, I know, but it's a significant place. That's what I want to say to you, is it's a significant place. It's a significant piece of real estate in biblical history. And the Israelites are going to be encamped there for the next 11 months and 5 days. God speaks to them from Sinai. God himself descends on Sinai and speaks. The description of Sinai is kind of terrifying. Thunder and clouds and fire, how God's manifesting himself. And his voice saying, I delivered you out of Egypt. I carried you out on eagle's wings. What he's saying is, you didn't work your way out of Egypt. You didn't talk your way out of Egypt. You didn't fight your way out of Egypt. I saved you. You couldn't save yourself. An Israelite could say from the base of Mount Sinai, I was in bondage under penalty of death. I was a slave in the land of the dying, but I took shelter, Passover, under the blood of the Lamb. And because of that, I was freed, saved, rescued, delivered by the power of God out of bondage. And that's our story too. That's our story too. It's a very clear image of the gospel. I haven't reached the promised land yet, but I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. But for now, I'm out here in the desert, occasionally climbing a mountain, and God is showing me how He wants me to live. That's what's happening at Sinai. The order of things, I think, is really critical to understand. God is explaining that deliverance comes before obedience. Here's what I mean by that. I have a friend that I am always looking for opportunities to have spiritual conversations with. He goes to church routinely. He's a really good guy, but he is not in relationship with Jesus. He said to me as recently as last week, I try to be really nice to people because I want to go to heaven when I die. You can't be that nice. You can't earn your way into the kingdom. It is a gift of God's grace. You know, the way it works is I'm accepted, and so I obey. Not that I obey so that I'm accepted. Or let me put it like this, my deliverance is not conditional on my obedience. It's more like my obedience is conditional on my deliverance. How good would you have to be to earn heaven? Well, you'd have to be perfect. Nobody here fits that bill. You'd have to be perfect. And since we're not perfect, we don't have any hope. You can't be nice enough. You can't walk enough old ladies across the street. Based on my own goodness, I have absolutely no hope of going to heaven. Now, my friend that I was talking about, I've expressed that to him. And he's pretty quick to say, no, you're a good guy. If you're not going to heaven, nobody's going to heaven. Well, I mean, if it weren't for the grace of Jesus, nobody would go to heaven because none of us are perfect. We've all sinned. What God is saying to the Israelites at the base of Sinai is, look, I delivered you. I saved you. I freed you. I rescued you. And He's brought them to this place so that they can learn to be a holy nation, a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests. So 1 Peter 2:9 kind of reflects back some of what God says to the Israelites in Exodus 19. But you are a chosen people, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness and into His wonderful light. So the rest of the book, as we walk through it, is not what Israel was saved from, it's what Israel was saved for. It's about being God's treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Because as it turns out, if you're saved, it's not just about being justified. It's also about being sanctified. What that is the daily process of Jesus making you more and more like He is. So it's not enough to be justified and to say, hey, I trusted Jesus. He has forgiven my sin. I'm going to heaven when I die. Awesome. High fives all around. But God is calling you for more. To be holy. To be sanctified. To be like Jesus. I mean, after all, Jesus didn't just say, believe in me. He said, follow me. Walk in my steps. Be like I am. Not just for a couple hours on Sunday morning. He's calling you to be like Him. When you're home, when you're at work, in your everyday walking around life, when you put on a badge and a gun, and to show the world what it looks like when Jesus wears a badge and a gun. The good news is, he is calling you to be holy, but he has no expectation that you're going to become holy on your own. He's at work in you, perfecting you, making you more like he is. And that's all I got to say about that.
Thanks for joining us on the 4Heroes podcast. This moment in Exodus 19 shaped Israel's identity and purpose, and it can shape ours as well. Like Frank said, it's not just about where God has brought us from, but where he's leading us and what he's calling us to become. As you go through your week, think about what it means to live as God's treasured possession. If you're a believer, you've been called out of darkness and into his marvelous light. What a gift we've been given.